All right, good morning. Good morning. I'm going to go ahead and get started. There's a couple people in the parking lot. They're on their way up, but I want to make sure and honor our time together. I'm really pumped that you all are here. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Josh Ellis. I'm one of the associate directors here. And what you are going to experience today, and hopefully the other 4 that are scheduled between now and the end of the year, is really kind of an experiment. It's an idea that I've been toying around with for years, and I finally put it in writing and put it in the hands of the other directors, and they said we should do this. This needs to happen. So. So this comes out of an experience that I had when I was doing a PhD in leadership studies. There were some really wonky academic times of that program where you're just writing and you're footnoting and you're doing all of that academic research. The fun part of that program, for me at least, was not actually the writing of it, but it was the sitting around with a group of people that were interested in leadership and really kicking the tires on those theories. This, hopefully, if it goes like I hope it will, this is not one of those leadership seminars or classes where a guy gets up, gives you a bullet list of 4 or 5 things to go home and do and practice or be, and everybody nods and says, yes, I need to do that, that sounds great, and then you leave. Hopefully, what this is a time of saying, well, here's an idea, here's a different idea, here's one approach to leadership. Here's a different approach to leadership. What works? What doesn't? That sounds like it makes sense. Maybe in my context that would work, and maybe in my context that doesn't work. I think a lot of you in here are pastors, though that's certainly not required as we go forward. In some of the later seminars throughout the year, we're going to have some chaplains and some other things in here. And so I want you to bring your experience to this and bring your context to this. And some of you have law enforcement backgrounds or military backgrounds or business backgrounds, and leadership can look different in those contexts. And so I want you to bring that to this. The first couple theories that we're going to talk about today is servant leadership and biblical servant leadership. And for people who grew up in the church, work in the church, you may think that that's a typo and that it should just be biblical servant leadership and what's with the other thing. But there's a whole body of research around servant leadership that has nothing to do with the Bible. And so we're going to walk through that today. We're going to put the two up against each other and see where it comes out. And I hope what this does for you is allows you to maybe find something new to read, maybe find a new idea to think on, maybe take something back to your team. I don't know exactly how it's going to help you, and I'm not trying to prescribe that, but I want to ask you to do a couple of things. And the first is I want you to think critically about what is presented. Like I said, I'm not even advocating for some of the theories that we're going to talk about over this kind of next 4 or 5 months. Some of them I think have major flaws in them, but they're interesting. A lot of them go to what people normally think of when they think of the term leadership. And so don't just take what I say for granted. Think critically, ask questions, bring your context, all of that. Push back against what you hear. And the second thing is, again, the end goal for this is to build our capacity. So what we're going to do this morning is you'll hear me talk a little bit and walk through some stuff. Hopefully we're going to discuss some things around tables, and so those of you that are pretty spread out, if those don't fill in the next 10 or 15 minutes, you may want to move around. But this is, I want to kind of create an environment where everything is on the table. So I'm going to present some tenets of biblical servant leadership, and some of you are going to think, I don't really like that, but it says biblical servant leadership. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say I don't like that. You are. In this place, I won't tell anybody. We'll edit it out of the video. So this is a safe place. If you want to disagree with biblical servant leadership, that's okay. All right? When it comes to leadership, one of the very first exposures that I had in the graduate program about leadership was I did not know how much research had been done, like actual academic research had been done on leadership. I thought it was all John Maxwell and Bill Hybels and a little bit of Jim Collins and Good to Great and some other stuff. I just didn't realize how long people had been chewing on this idea of what is leadership. Now, to be fair, in one sense, leadership is a very new discipline. I mean, academically, it's really only been studied since the beginning of 1900. And that puts it behind a lot of other disciplines. Now, on the other hand, leadership is one of those things that has been taken for granted pretty much throughout human history. And usually the way that that takes shape is by looking at what's called the great man theory. Okay, now, women in the audience, you're going to hear a lot of male references, especially at the beginning here. And that's because in the early parts of human history, the idea of a woman being a leader was just not palatable. And so women in leadership has actually been, it's developed as its own discipline within the leadership studies. But initially, we're looking, if you want to look at the Bible, you pick out individual characters, right? You go to Moses, you go to David, you go to those okay, that is the archetype of a leader. And then when you look outside that, people say Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and then you move forward. And you'll find a lot of times that those people were military figures, usually because leadership was equated to some sort of victory or some sort of accomplishment. And that actually fed into leadership research between 1900 and 1930. Everything was about getting people to do what you wanted them to do. In fact, there's a quote from 1927, and it says, "Leadership is the ability to impress the will of the leader on those led and induce obedience, respect, loyalty, and cooperation." Now, my boss still wishes a little bit that it would be like that, okay? But that was leadership, right? I mean, get people to do what you want them to do. And in the military context, it's take that hill. Don't ask why. Don't ask where it fits into the overall campaign. I say jump, you say how high, right? So that was leadership all the way up until, the mid-30s. Now, put George Washington's picture up here because he's still thought of as one of the go-to great men in history, okay? Leaders are, and then you fill in the blank, and if you say, well, who do you think of as a great leader, it's very common for people to say George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., but for different reasons. Because as you kind of move through history and how leadership has progressed, it got out of this getting people to do what we want them to do kind of domination, and then it got into, we need to start thinking about what are the behaviors that people do as great leaders. Now, a great man theory depends on you naturally being a leader. Like you have just in your DNA the certain things, you have the leadership gene, and it consists of these things. As thinking started to expand on that, people were like, well, I can do certain things, I can build my capacities as a leader if I become a better listener, if I become a better vision caster, if I am more dedicated to the lives of my followers and that kind of thing. And so people started looking at what are the behaviors. And that went through the 40s, and then people started saying, well, groups act differently than individuals, right? You get a bunch of people in a room, and their behavior will feed off each other in a different way than somebody would in a one-on-one conversation. And so people started looking at leadership in groups. And then we get to the 60s and really the 70s. And in the 70s, everybody's talking about organizational excellence, right? You couldn't be a leader, or you couldn't be thought of as a leader without being able to point to your resume and saying, well, I took this organization from point A to point B. I grew it either in its bottom line, or I was a pastor and I grew it from a small church to a big church. Whatever it was, everything was about organizational excellence. And interestingly, you would think kind of we're on a progression of leadership thought. This organizational excellence theory actually kicked us all the way back to the great man and the trait theory, because we started looking at really successful business leaders, not at necessarily what they did and the skills that they developed, but who were they? What kind of people were they? When did they get up in the morning? What was the first 5 things that they did in the morning? That kind of thing. What did they read? What did they not read? How did they speak? How did they communicate? That kind of thing. And so right away, you are back into traits. Now, right along the same time in the 70s, people started to have a little bit of distance from, in particular, the civil rights movement, but also presidency of JFK and a couple of really, really charismatic leaders that were in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And people thought there's something about that. It's not necessarily that that person had something, in their DNA that made them a leader, but they had some ability to gather and rally people around them. And Martin Luther King Jr. is a perfect example of that. And so a whole discipline of studying charismatic leadership developed out of that. And we're actually going to chew that up, not the next session, but the session after that in October. We're going to talk about charismatic leadership, and that is leading right up to the election. So welcome to that. But if you work around this, you'll see a lot of different leadership theories represented in pictures. I put Superman up there because actually Superman is a good example not of a great man, because Superman, yes, he had some innate things in his DNA, but it wasn't the fact that he was literally an alien that made him great, right? What is it about Superman that made him Superman? He's faster than a speeding bullet, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound, that kind of thing. And I put Christopher Reeve up here because he is Superman and everybody else is second place. But so, bringing out the little nerd in me, that's the way it is. And so, so he's a good example of behaviors in leadership and skills in leadership. And then you have John Maxwell in the middle of that. And John Maxwell represents kind of a school of leadership that I call axiomatic. I was sitting next to a guy at the Global Leadership Summit a couple weeks ago, and he's furiously scribbling notes when John Maxwell's speaking. And I wasn't taking any, and I leaned over and I said, "What are you writing down?" He goes, "Man, everything this guy says is gold." And I said, "That's because everything he says fits on a bumper sticker really neatly." Now, that guy then turned to me and said, "How old are you? Nobody has bumper stickers anymore. We're tweeting everything he says." I'm like, "Okay, fine. Yes, that's true." That hurt, by the way. That was a deep personal cut to me. But those leadership axioms, right? Here are the 5 things you need to do. Of course, they all start with the same letter, or they spell something, whatever it is. But there's a whole school of leadership that's axiomatic, okay? It's just little, the fortune cookies of leadership. And those are valuable. Right? There's huge value in what Maxwell and Hybels and others have added to the leadership canon. It's just not the only thing out there. And so you see different examples up here. In fact, there's a picture of Byron Leftwich, which is this quarterback down in the right-hand corner. When he was playing for Marshall, the college that he was playing for. Wow, okay, a little love for Marshall. Didn't plan on that happening. Byron Leftwich hurts his leg in the game, has to leave. His team starts getting crushed by Akron, and he goes to the hospital, gets an X-ray. They put an air cast on him. They rush him back. He had a sheriff speed him back to the game, and he hobbles onto the field wearing an air cast on his leg. Now, this would be a great movie if they won that game. Okay, they did not win that game. So, but you can watch this whole evolution of this game on YouTube, and you can hear interviews from the players. And even though they lost that game, you would never know it if you asked the players that played for Byron that day. In fact, these guys carried him down the field in between plays because he was so hobbling around that he just couldn't make it. But they're like, "Man, if he's back there, we got a chance." There's a whole school of emergent leadership. What is it that brings leaders out of the woodwork in particular circumstances or contingencies? And so he's a really great example of that. If you're not familiar with that story, Google Byron Leftwich on YouTube and watch the little 8-minute documentary on that, and I think you will find it interesting. So, various schools of leadership. What we're going to do today specifically is we're going to chew on biblical servant leadership and servant leadership. Now, servant leadership came first. I know that sounds weird, but in kind of academia, servant leadership comes first, and it comes mostly from a guy named Robert Greenleaf. Now, Robert Greenleaf graduated in 1920-something with a math degree and promptly went to work for AT&T, which in the day was one of the largest corporations in the world. And he, other than that, had no formal training. He just kind of got fed into the AT&T pipeline, and Robert Greenleaf had a heart to serve the people around him. And what that did for his career is he starts to rise up through the ranks. In fact, he worked for AT&T 38 years, retired, and then started writing down everything that he had been thinking the whole time, and that kind of launched him into the second career where he published some articles and essays on servant leadership. But he's kind of the guy that kicked off this idea that if you have influence as a leader, your job is to give that influence away. Your job is, as a leader, is to pour yourself into the people who follow you and make them better. And if you as a leader demonstrate service to your followers, then they will kind of catch that and they will start serving the people that follow them. And all of a sudden you have this trickle-down effect, or works its way up from the bottom, if you want to flip the pyramid kind of on the org chart. And all of a sudden you have entire corporations that are serving the greater community. Okay, and so there are two companies that you have heard of that practice servant leadership as designed by Greenleaf and others that came after him. One is Southwest Airlines, and the other is Starbucks. And they go out of their way to teach this idea of servant leadership to their employees. And so there's a great story of a Southwest airline attendant who is on a layover. Plane got rerouted to a different place. They're not going to get off the tarmac, or they're not going to let people deplane, but they're sitting at the gate. They're getting ready to turn around, and a woman comes up to the flight attendant and says, "We've been on this plane so long. I have fed my kids everything that I have to give them. This is going to, can I just get off the plane and get them something to eat? And I will come right back." And the flight attendant says, "Well, I can't let you do that, because as soon as the plane is ready, we're going to go. And if you're not back on board, that's going to obviously cause some problems. But the plane will not leave without me." And so she gets off the plane and goes to buy food for this mom and about 4 others on the plane that had small kids, and brings them back and says, "Here, let's make life better for everybody." That's a really good example of servant leadership. Now, and she was taught in their leadership development program and in their employee management program to think like that. To think, how is it that I would want somebody to respond to me in this exact circumstance, and that's how I'm going to respond. And so you see companies doing this. You see a real focus on meeting the needs of the employees within an organization, meeting their highest priority needs. And so the job as a leader of an organization is to provide what your employees need first. And one of the kind of tenets of servant leadership is that providing high quality work is as or more important than providing a high quality service or product to your customers. Now just think about that for a second. That is completely countercultural as far as leadership is concerned, because we talked about organizational effectiveness, right? Organizational effectiveness is almost always measured by the bottom line somehow. And what servant leadership is saying, no, we're going to lean into our employees first, and then we're going to worry about the bottom line second. And so Robert Greenleaf starts writing all these essays down. There's there are a couple of really good leadership kind of anthologies, kind of collections of theories. One of them is out on the table there. And Nordhaus says this is the only leadership theory that focuses primarily on caring for the followers. Now just let that sink in for a second. This is the only real leadership theory that focuses primarily on caring for the followers. And then it also says it's the only one to really focus on giving away influence as opposed to acquiring it and gathering it for the leader. So I'm going to put a quote in front of you here. And this is a quote from Greenleaf. And this is one of his most famous, most iconic quotes. And so somebody asked him, how do you know if someone is a servant leader? What's the test for it? And this was his answer. The difference manifests itself in the care taken by the servant first to make sure that other people's highest priority needs are being served. The best test, and difficult to administer, is, do those served grow as persons? Do they, while being served, become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, more likely themselves to become servants? And what is the effect on the least privileged in society? Will they benefit, or at least not be further deprived? So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to just throw this out to you. First blush, what do you think about this? What do you think about these ideas of servant leadership? Sound good? Sound bad? Pie in the sky? This is the way they all should be thinking? Give me something. What do you think?
I'll go with the last one. This is the way they all should be thinking.
Okay.
Completely agree.
Okay. Anybody else?
In business, a lot of times it's the customer first when they talk quality
Sure.
and sustainability as a company, because they place the client as being the source and the livelihood of that business.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, you walk into a Chick-fil-A and you watch these little teenagers. You see a bunch of brats all over the place, and you walk into Chick-fil-A, it's a totally different attitude. And I know that they're being served in a way that's helping them to grow as persons. And I know that what they're doing there is their job, but I believe that when they leave that job, they're going to be better persons for what they did. So I totally agree with this.
Yeah, Chick-fil-A is a good example. The test for me on organizations like that seem too good to be true is check the blogs, check Twitter. Where are the employees that leave that organization and go, it's not really like that. They hate us. They treat us like dirt. We're supposed to smile. You just don't get that from Southwest, from Chick-fil-A, from some of these other organizations that lean into their employees like this. You hear flight attendants, pilots, and that kind of thing say, man, I love working for this company. I worked as hard as I could to get to this company. I know pilots that left a top tier position at other airlines so they go to the bottom of the ladder at Southwest because they like the corporate culture that much better. What else about this? Anything else about this seem okay? All right, we're moving. Yeah.
It seems that it would build just so much more buy-in and investment into the church or company, where the case would be, from the employees.
Yeah, I think, and Greenleaf says that's a given, like automatic. Yes, I mean if people love their job, right, and they know that the people they work for care for them, they are more likely to go above and beyond, right? They're more likely to invest in the place that they work. So yeah, Greenleaf would take that and run with it all day. So here's the other question: why don't all companies work like this? I mean, let's just remember, this is a safe place, okay? So, because they're all stupid. I mean, we'll edit that out of the video, it's fine. Why don't all companies work like this? Because clearly they don't, right?
Right.
Not all companies work like Southwest, so why not?
Because it goes uphill against the trend. We're all self-centered individuals.
Okay. There are a whole bunch of leadership theorists that discount servant leadership purely based on what you just said. They said, talk about utopian, okay? Not enough people like that have a servant's heart, and certainly not enough people to run organizations to make this work in every organization. So that's usually the first thing that they go to. What else? Why else don't companies work like this? Yeah.
I think to piggyback off of what my brother said, that I think there's this view that I'm the CEO, I'm a manager, I'm in this position of authority for a reason. So I'm up here. So the deal is, we look down and we block orders for people to get to where we are. And so it's this mindset that I'm here and you need to get here the best way you can or the best way you know how, opposed to humbly coming alongside of those people and bringing them to the place that you want them to be.
Yeah, Greenleaf and others would say you get to a position of leadership so that you have more influence to give away. Mm-hmm. Well, the flip of that is I earned this position, right? I earned the C-suite, I earned the corner office, I earned the perks, and if you work really hard, You can earn them too, but it's not necessarily my job to help you. A lot of my analogies are sports analogies, so sorry about that. But a few years ago, well, more than a few now, I guess, when Brett Favre was playing for the Green Bay Packers and they drafted Aaron Rodgers, they went to Brett Favre and they said, so you're going to mentor, this new draft pick of yours because he's a quarterback, you're a quarterback, and you're going to bring him up. And Brett Favre looked right at that reporter and said, that's not my job. It's not my job to develop that guy. Now, in Brett Favre's defense, right, it's a weird dynamic because what the reporter was asking Brett Favre is, are you going to make it easier for this guy to take your job? And Brett Favre said, no, I like my job, And so there are two sides to this, and there are some caveats to this. So let's look at how wait a second. Let's look at how the model works. And my phone is causing issues here. There we go. So when leadership theorists and academics get a hold of something, it's got to have boxes and arrows. Okay, so when you look at a model, it has to have boxes and arrows. This is how it works, and they use terms like antecedent conditions. Now, this middle box, the servant leader behaviors, ignore that middle box for a second, because every person that writes on servant leadership has a different something in that box. Okay, some of them have 10, some have 8, 5, 6, whatever. I'm going to show you that graph in just a second. I hope it makes you giggle a little bit. But the antecedent conditions are what we need to talk about right now. If you're going to do servant leadership, a couple of things have to be in place first, at least as far as the research is concerned. When they research this, they're like, okay, it works in certain environments, like environments where a context where caring for people is more natural. Great. Give me an example of what that would be. Skip church work, that's the Sunday school answer, we don't need that one. So give me another industry where caring for people is more...
Healthcare.
Do what?
Hospital health.
Exactly. Healthcare, yeah, absolutely. Childcare, you hope, right? Yeah. Healthcare and nonprofit world in general are the ones that say this has the greatest likelihood of success because it's more natural and probably a freer environment to care for people. The culture also matters in this. There are cultures around the world where power, where a position of authority is held in a very high but also distant esteem, right? That person is the king, the prince, the president, the prime minister, whatever, and they are there in their tower, and that is where leaders belong. We are the followers, and we're back here. We do not belong up there, right? And then there are other cultures that don't have such a power distance there, and they say, well, yeah, he's the prime minister, but I mean, he just became the prime minister like yesterday. Until that, he was like, wow, my friend. So, those are cultures much more comfortable with positions of power being shared among people. Those are good roots, right? That's good fertile ground for servant leadership. Now, the second one, this leader attributes, servant leadership theory depends on these guys having a couple of innate things about them, some passions for them that allow them to do this kind of leadership. You want to guess at some of what they are? Okay, let me rephrase that. I'm going to take a sip of my coffee. You guess at what they are. What do you think somebody would need to kind of be predisposed to do and to think as far as leadership capacities for servant leadership?
Self-wisdom.
Absolutely, yeah. And academia treats that as altruistic, right? They are in it to give it away. They are in it for other people. What else? Some other characteristics.
Vision sharing,
Why so?
in order to influence the group around them.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, the reason I asked you why is because typically, if you ask somebody what leadership is, if they want to throw down the coffee cup definition, leadership's influence, right? Who said that? Anybody? Yeah, everybody knows John Maxwell said that. Nobody knows when John Maxwell said that. He said that like decades ago, and then he wrote 25 books about it. But so leadership is influence, but particular to this, what do you have to sell people on as far as leadership and influence in order to make servant leadership work? Huh?
I would say hope.
Hope? Yeah, that's definitely one of them. Sure.
Yourself, the leader has to sell himself. In particular, in kind of that if I'm not excited about the vision, then I can't get you excited. So the leader has to sell himself in essence to kind of sell the vision.
So you're saying that they're kind of themselves a walking billboard for this kind of approach. I think that's true. You got to be able to pitch some degree of hope. Yes, that's definitely there. Anything else?
Humility.
Absolutely. Why do you have to be humble in order to make this work?
Or else pride. Pride. I mean, if you're not humble, then you can't give it away because you want to hoard it all for yourself so you can look better. And that's one reason.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting the dynamic that just got presented. So you have a guy who has to be able to cast a vision and walk that out in a way that it's contagious and communicates it. You also have to have that guy be humble, right, about it. And because if you're not humble, right, is your natural inclination to give stuff away? No. It is, I worked for this, I earned this, I attained this for myself. And so there has to be an aspect of humility, at least not thinking more highly of yourself than you are, right? And so there's an aspect of that. And also in the literature about this, remember, this is all secular leadership theory, they commonly go to a sense of calling for this. And it's always interesting to me when you read secular leadership theorists use a word like calling that many of us use on a daily basis, right? But they say you, as a leader, you almost have to be called to this approach. It has to be kind of a life mission. Now, in the nonprofit world and in healthcare and in the church world, in some of these worlds where caring for people is not just more accepted, it's desired, right? It's looked for. But if you bring this to an industry, right, that is outside of those, if you bring this to a marketplace or a business, you really have to be called to this kind of leadership, right? Because everything pushing against you is going to go counter to this kind of thinking. And so you have a couple of things that also go into that. And then there's this box, follower receptivity. The leadership theorists that have looked at this have said there are times when this works, and there are times when this doesn't work. Okay? Can you think of a time where this may not work? Just this is going to be pushing it uphill, and we're better off not trying. Can you think of an environment that it wouldn't work? Because there's a couple that usually come up.
I would think in an emergency situation.
Yeah. If somebody yells fire, right? This is not the time to go, does everybody feel good about fire? Everybody feel good about where the exits are? We're all okay, No, that is move, that is get out, things are burning, let's not be among them, right? So yeah, an emergency situation, what else? What else would this kind of be? Crisis. Yeah, crisis, emergency. And then there's a tangent of that. Imagine trying to do this in a military environment. And leadership theorists use the military a lot for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is leadership theorists usually come to that and go, what is it about that guy when he yells, follow me, and he runs into gunfire, that all these other guys and gals behind him say, yeah, let's do that, and they follow him. And so leadership theorists have been chewing on that for, 100 years. In a rigorous academic setting. And so to bring a kind of bottom-up approach to leadership to a military environment would be like a general and the privates and the specialists saying, let's all get together, let's, work on a common defined, I'm going to really lean into you, and we'll worry about mission execution after all of that, right? Just saying that to someone in the military, they might take a swing at you. It's just not the way it works. So there are environments where this is harder than it needs to be, right? So then you have all these, the antecedent conditions, the ground in which this kind of stuff grows. You have the servant leader behaviors. We'll get to that in a second. And then you have the outcomes. And this is where we talk about that trickle-down effect. Servant leadership, when it's done well, raises the performance of the people who are served. Okay? Which in turn raises the performance of the organization. And according to Greenleaf, that raises the impact and for the good that organization has on society. It's interesting to me that this theory focuses so much on the good of society. Okay, because leadership in a vacuum, when you consider what leadership is it always concerned with what is good for society? Is it?
No. It's not.
Yeah, I mean, in a vacuum, leadership has almost nothing to do with society. Now, when you start adding in other factors and context and stuff, then you might be able to make a case for it. But by itself, leadership has nothing to do with the outside of society. Greenleaf would say, no, that's not how it works. It has to benefit society. Now, there are a couple of other people that have written on this. One of the books that I put out on the table, if you want to peruse it or maybe get it on Amazon, you can get it cheap, is Max De Pree. He wrote The Leadership is an Art. He also wrote Leadership is Jazz. He ran the Herman Miller Furniture Company for a long time, and he's a big servant leader guy. Less theorists and more axiomatic, but and he just said simply, this is his favorite quote: "First job of a leader is to define reality." Okay? The second job, the last, is to say thank you. And everything in between, you are a servant and a debtor. Now, servant, self-explanatory with what we've just been saying. Why does he say that a leader must be a debtor?
Their success to others.
Yeah, and you use the key word there. They owe their success to others. Servant leaders, when they're walking out this theory, they view it as something that has been given to them as opposed to something that they have taken for themselves. And so when you see servant leaders that are really steeped in this theory, they consider it a debt to not only the people that they serve, their followers, but also to the organization. They owe them. And so they owe, I am obligated to give my best performance. I am obligated to lean into the people that follow me. I am obligated to do those things because, in the best case scenario, somebody did that for me, right? Again, we get back to that trickle-down effect. Now, Stephen Covey, who wrote, 7 Habits and some other things, he was a big servant leader guy. Ken Blanchard did some stuff with servant leadership. Peter Block, Margaret Wheatley, there are some others out there. And on your notes, I gave you a handout, and believe me, I could have given you a bibliography. The bibliography for my dissertation was almost as long as my dissertation. So I can load you up with books if you want, books and articles. But what I did for each category is give you kind of the top 3 or 4 things that if you were interested in chasing more about this, those are the sources that I would start with, and if you want more. But you'll see Max De Pree, his book on there. So when I said, oh yeah, go ahead.
And there is, the Stanley guy. What's the son? Andy. Yeah, he had an interview, and it's on YouTube with Cheryl Blanchard or Blanchard, the CEO of Popeyes, and she was talking about how servant leadership. She took on a challenge because she wanted to see if servant leadership could actually maximize profitability. And she took a company whose stock had dropped like $13 and some change, and she took that, and over a course of I think a year or 2, the stock had went back up to I think maybe between $34 and $40. But that interview was really great as well because she was talking about how the servant leadership model, how she used that in turning the company around.
Nice. Okay. I didn't know about that. Nice. So when academics get a hold of something, right, there are always boxes and arrows when they describe the model. There's also always a list. It's a list of characteristics or behaviors or skills or whatever it is. And you can tell none of these people are in ministry because they don't spell anything going down. They don't start with the same letter. None of that. But when they write on these things, so everybody took Greenleaf, who wrote essays in the 70s. And he just talked about it a lot. He actually taught a little bit at MIT and he taught a little bit at Harvard. But for the most part, most of his essays got published either near the end of his life or after he died in 1990 by a guy named Larry Spears. And so Larry Spears extracted from everything that Greenleaf was doing, and he knew Greenleaf personally. In fact, Spears ran the Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership, which you'll see a link to on your handout there. He extracted 10 things about servant leadership from everything that Greenleaf wrote. And then other academics, and don't worry, some of you are freaking out. It's okay, we're not going to get into all these lists. But everybody looks at that initial list and says, okay, is that really true? And then you get a bunch of academics trying to say, how do we measure this? Is there an instrument that we can produce that says, yes, these people are practicing servant leadership, these people are not? And so these are some of the big theorists that have messed with this. And some people said, no, it's not 10, it's really 5. That came out in 2006, and you'll see that altruistic calling. You'll see the term persuasive mapping, which I love that term. It's a complicated way of saying casting vision, but that's basically what it is. And then you'll see others, Sip and Frick had 7 pillars. The other guys had 5 characteristics. These guys have 7 pillars. The next list has 8. And then you have somebody come along in 2010 that said, there's really nothing new about servant leadership except for what I indicated in purple, and that is a responsible morality and a transcendental spirituality. They say other than that, this is all transformational leadership and authentic leadership, which are leadership theories, and we'll talk about those some other time. And so, hello. Gotta worry about the iPhone and the guy in the hand of a guy who walks around and waves his hands a lot. And so they came along and said, okay, all of these things would fit in that middle box of the model. These are all the leadership behaviors or characteristics or whatever. So what we're going to do is look at what one of these, how this fleshes out a little bit. And so I picked Sip and Frick, and they talk about the 7 pillars of servant leadership. Now, these are the 7. Now, under each of these 7 things, they have 3 bullets, okay? So somebody is like, well, I want to memorize what it is to be a servant leader. Good job. You have 21 things to memorize here. Good luck with that. But I don't think it's necessary to memorize it, but I want to highlight a couple of things in this list. Now, when it talks about a person of character, and remember, these are secular leadership theorists. When it talks about a person of character, what do you think they're talking about? What does a person of character look like?
Honest?
Yeah, honest, trustworthy. Because are you going to follow someone, specifically in this model, that you don't trust? Because, just think about this. If you're in a servant leadership system, and this person says, I'm here to serve you, let me help you, and you don't trust them, right? Or you don't believe that what they are saying is really in your best interest, the whole system falls apart immediately, right? So yes, they absolutely have to be trustworthy. What else about this person? We talked about it earlier. A person of character in this particular model has to have a high degree of humility. They have to. Because otherwise, again, you're not going to believe them, right? If this is a guy, like if the next president of Southwest Airlines comes from Wall Street, comes from, they worked for a big bank, and like their whole career was climbing over people in order to achieve what they wanted, and then they come to Southwest Airlines and said, hey, we're going to model servant leadership. Are you going to believe that guy? Probably not. Now, he may be a great guy, and he may be able to pull it off, but if you're looking at the lifestyle and you're looking at a track record, you're probably not going to give him the benefit of the doubt. So, you go down and then you have an actual tenet. You put other people's first. Skilled communicator. We talked about that a little bit. Something that we didn't talk about in the communication model, we talked about casting vision, right? You got to be able to do that. What else do you have to do to be a good servant leader as far as communication? Yeah, that's it right there. you have to be able to listen. How many of you have been to the doctor's office and had a visit where you don't feel like you said anything, right? Like you went in and you go, well, I have this thing. Oh, well, let me do a check here. I'm going to look at this, take this temperature. Okay, here's what's wrong with you. Boom, here's the script. See ya. Anybody ever had that experience? It's maddening for certain personality types like me who I like answers, kind of obsessive about that. And so if I don't feel like the doctor's really listening to me, I don't feel like I'm, really telling them what's going on, I don't feel like they have an accurate understanding of the situation. Same thing goes for servant leadership. If somebody says, I'm here to serve you, and then never allows you to speak, it's less convincing, right? So definitely part of the communication there. This number 4, compassionate collaborator. And again, this is all secular theory here. A compassionate collaborator, why is it that someone in servant leadership would need to be a collaborator of any kind? Why do you think that is?
I would assume because you're saying to yourself and then you're saying to the folks that are following you that I don't know everything. And so you are in essence empowering them that as you come to the table that you're gifted in certain ways that I'm not. And so as we share, you empower them to have to join the conversation and you build consensus when you do that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And remember, one of the kind of things that you bring to servant leadership as a leader is the sense that somebody brought you along, right?
Right.
Somebody poured into you.
I come along your side and work together with you.
Yeah,
And that shows you that I care.
absolutely.
If you believe that I care, you're probably 99.9% of the time going to respond.
Yeah,
I
and
don't want you to respond.
yeah, and now and see now let's dive into that for just a second. There are a lot of leadership theories that say if my followers believe that I care about them, then they will do what I say. Okay? Servant leadership comes alongside those theories and says, if my followers believe that I care about them, then we will do great things together. Now, that sounds like a semantic difference, but it's actually huge as far as the life of an organization and how things get walked out. Because on the one hand, if you say, these people know that I care about them, therefore they will do what I say, who is it still all about? It's all about me, right? And you're just a hair away from just blatant manipulation, right? Because notice in that kind of thinking, they don't have to actually be cared for. They just have to think that I care about them. And then I have them, and then now I can do whatever I want. Servant leadership says, no, you actually have to care about these people. And they have to not only believe that, but they actually have to care about you back. Which is why this doesn't always work in every environment. So there's definitely some give and take, and there's some focus on the relationship there, which is another thing that sets it apart as a leadership theory. There are a lot of leadership theories that just focus on the leader. So if you do these things, people will follow you, right? This focuses on the relationship between the leader and the follower. This dynamic, number 5, says foresight. Foresight's used all over the literature. It's not just the idea that you want to be visionary, but it's also the idea that if you know people and if you're really pouring into people and you really care for people, then you can kind of understand how they're going to react in certain circumstances, right? In high stress situations, if you know someone really well, then you can communicate that stress. You can kind of anticipate how they're going to react, right? Some people in stressful situations, they need to chew on it. They need to, marinate in it for a while. They need to be by themselves, and then they will come back and go, okay, game time, I'm ready to go. Some people, you pitch them a stressful situation, they're like, man, let's think later. Let's do it now, right? Well, you can only know how those people are going to react differently if you're really pouring into them. And so that's where some of this foresight comes from. You also, in this, servant leaders, there's a reason that a lot of people talk about being a servant leader but aren't very good at it. And it actually goes to they're not very creative. And here's, in fact, one of the columns on there, their whole instrument as far as measuring servant leadership was really geared toward can servant leaders also be creative? Because think about it, this is a leadership theory that depends on someone being a really good people person, right? You cannot be a servant leader with really low emotional intelligence. If you can't work with people, then you can't do this, because all you do as a leader is pour into people. And so when you are in an environment where you're constantly in the middle of all these relationships and you're getting to know your employees, your followers, you're getting to know their families, you're getting to know what makes them tick, the more you do that and the more people that you are trying to lead, the more that environment's going to move around on you, right? You're going to have a lot of different situations. This guy's going to come to work and it's going to be a bad day and it's going to affect the whole team, right? I'm a collaborator, I'm a team builder. So I got to know how to creatively work with all these moving parts, which makes this kind of a complicated leadership theory. But you got to be able to do that. And so that's where this last dynamic of systems thinking comes in. You got to understand that when you build a team, each part of the team works with the other parts in a particular way, right? You can't just say, well, I have a friend of mine who works for a technology company, and he says, the chief technology person over here is like the worst people person you can imagine, right? They have no people skills at all, but they work with computers all day, so that's okay. He said, now, we have over here another person on the senior leadership team, and their whole job is to manage the team dynamics. And they are also a terrible people person. Okay? Now, it doesn't take a leadership theorist or even someone believing in servant leadership to know that's probably not going to work, right? So you got to be able to diagnose the systems a little bit better than that. And so you see that on here, and then you see moral authority, and you see that come into play. Now, I'm going to give you this quote, and I'm going to ask you, I'm going to release you to a coffee break for just like 5 minutes. But get your coffee and come back to your tables, and if you're not sitting with someone else, this is where you may want to move around a little bit. And I want you to ask yourself the question, is this quote true? Is this true? Because what Greenleaf says here is a new moral principle is emerging. Now remember, he wrote this in the 70s. So, we're almost 50 years past when he wrote this. A new moral principle is emerging which holds that the only authority deserving one's allegiance is that which is freely and knowingly granted by the led to the leader in response to and in proportion to the clearly evident servant stature of the leader. Those who choose to follow this principle will not casually accept the authority of the existing institutions. Rather, they will freely respond only to individuals who are chosen as leaders because they are proven and trusted as servants. So, go get your coffee, come back, kick this around at your table. All right, so, what do you think about this? Is this true? Is there a new moral principle emerging? You say no.
Yes and no.
Oh, yes and no. Cheater? Pick one or the other. Is this true? No, I'm just kidding. Why do you say yes and no, or why do you say yes? Why do you say no? Give me some feedback.
No.
No. Why do you say no?
I think that it's limited to the range of influence per leader.
Okay.
And in the middle of there, it talks about accept the authority of the existing institution. Now, the existing institution, apart from the leader, depending upon where that leader is in that institution, that's another factor that leader has to answer to.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah.
I would almost say it's true.
Okay.
I worked for 30 years with the Houston Independent School District. Watch kids, how they interacted with teachers. The teacher is a leader. The teacher is a person of authority or a position of leadership or whatever you want to call it. And yet, most of the time, or a lot of times, a lot of those kids did not accept the leadership of the teacher, and no learning took place, and nothing actually happened in the class, but a bunch of conflicts. So they weren't willing to accept the teacher as a leader, even though the teacher was the leader, because of something that was lacking between the teacher or the leader and the followers.
Yeah. Okay. Does the answer have to be an absolute?
Nope.
Okay.
In fact, it rarely is when you kick stuff like this around. Rarely.
Twice it uses the word only.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Kind of limited,
Yeah.
because it's almost like it's something that's always, but it's not true, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and Robert Greenleaf believed this to his core. Like, if you asked, him, he would have said only. He would have spoken in absolutes.
So I'm going to say as long as it's not true in all cases, right? So I think in some cases it's true, in some cases it's not. Yeah, can I have that answer?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, because that's a reality, right? I mean, that's,
Right.
different industries, different
You always find
environments.
the circumstance that would make that false.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're saying it's a definite maybe? Is that what
There
you're
you go.
saying?
That's right. With authority, I would say it's a definite maybe. I'm feeling very good about that. Well, and the funny thing is you brought up different situations. There's a whole leadership theory called situational leadership, which means this applies in that context and this doesn't. Or this applies with that follower, but not that one. So yeah, TJ, what were you going to say?
This might be the wrong way of saying this, but I think in the overculture in American life, it's not true. Because we think about who the leaders are. When I read that, I thought about the presidential election, thinking, but that's not exactly leadership either. It's a different thing than what happens in organizations that we are part of and actually work with people. And there, I think it is much more true than not. So I think that distinction helped me think about, that's a true statement for me in the context in which I'm following somebody or leading somebody. Maybe not true for what's going on with me.
Sure.
Yeah, and actually, well, Bobby, we're going to come back to that. What are you going to say, Bob?
When it says those who choose to follow this principle will not casually accept the authority of the existing institutions, and we do casually accept the authority of things that we don't morally agree with quite regularly. So I don't think that's a new moral principle that's emerging. I feel like it's going backwards. Morally, we're kind of allowing leadership to take us far from what we firmly believe in as believers. And so, no, I don't think that.
He did a lot of his writing in the 60s and 70s, and he had in mind college students a lot of the time, because at that particular point, I mean, think about this, the protests and the war effort, and all of the things that were going on there. Do what?
The hippie era.
Yeah. I mean, and he basically looked at college students and saw the lack of hope, saw the lack of vision. And so when he was kind of writing this, he was thinking, if college professors would build into their students and lean into their students and care for their students, they might have that sense of hope again. And so he kind of chased that. But it brings me back to something that Bobby and TJ both kind of hinted at. Do we follow people because they demonstrate themselves to be servants? Sometimes I think we do, right? If we have the option.
If we have the option, yeah.
But then there are other times that we don't care, right? I did not pick the guy who handles my retirement account on his track record of caring about my family. I hope he cares about my family in that I hope he makes a lot of money, right? So, but I don't, if he's really caring of my family and very interested in how my son's first day of kindergarten went yesterday, and he's a terrible money manager, right? I'm going to fire him. So in one instance, you're like, but that's a very transactional relationship. And I think some of us are saying, yeah, sometimes that's how it works.
That's what you would do. A lot of people wouldn't do that. They said, this guy really cares about us. They stick with him.
I hope to have better retirements than they do. Or maybe they know more people than I do. I don't know. That's possible too.
The buy-in has to be if followers feel they're going to benefit from it.
And a lot of that comes down to how the followers are measuring their own benefit, right? Because you can benefit a lot from a transactional relationship, right? You can choose to work for a company that doesn't directly serve you, but okay, great, there's a very easy ladder to climb here. I'm going to advance rapidly. I'm going to make money. I'm going to be able to take care of my family. There's all kinds of tangential benefits to that. But you may not pick a company saying, well, I know that manager and they'd take a bullet for me, So in some instances it works, in some instances it doesn't. Now, so we're going to contrast servant leadership with biblical servant leadership. Because what happens is, somewhere along the line, seminaries get involved and theologians get involved, and they start saying, wait a second, all this talk about servant leadership, and nobody really has mentioned Jesus. Now, in the case of Greenleaf, that's not actually true. Greenleaf did talk about Jesus. He actually came to be a Quaker in the middle of his life, and he mentions in his writing not only was Jesus the example of servant leadership, but that the whole theory is kind of grounded in what he termed Judeo-Christian values. Now, of course, you have other servant leadership theorists that come along and they're like, that's nice, but let's talk about Jesus and Gandhi and, let's get this away from being overtly religious. And so now you have kind of a genre of leadership come along and they say, no, if we're going to talk about servant leadership, it belongs in an overtly religious context. And so you have Gene Wilkes, who wrote Jesus on Leadership, one of the books that's on your handouts and out there. He comes along at the same time as several others, but he's kind of seen as one of the leaders in this biblical servant leadership. And he comes along with a quote like this: "You will never become a servant leader until you first become a servant to the leader."
Joshua.
Right, yeah. I mean, now, so he would say to Greenleaf, in fact, he writes a chapter on general servant leadership at the end of his Jesus on Leadership book, and he kind of goes at the secular servant leadership theorists and says, yeah, but you're missing Jesus. You're missing the relationship with Christ, who was the servant, and that is where this comes from. Because, well, let me see if you can see where he's going with this. Why would you, and Gene Wilkes is a pastor. He's a pastor in the Plano area, just north of Dallas. He was my professor for this class, which is I read his book and then was asked to critique it to him. So that's intimidating. That class was also taught by Norm Blackaby, who wrote Spiritual Leadership, also one of the books on our syllabus, I'm sure by accident. And so I heard it straight from these guys. Why do you think he would say you will never be a servant leader until you first become a servant to the leader? Where's he going with that?
Well, a servant leader has to be a servant. So to be a servant leader, you have to learn to be a servant first.
Well, yeah, but you have secular leaders that say, I don't need to be a Christ follower in order to learn how to be a servant to people. That's what they would come back with. And Gene Wilkes is like, hold on. Yeah, Ed, what were you going to say?
Doesn't it fit with humility and relationship, and in the sense we've talked about those things are necessary to be a servant leader? You've got to have that ability to see it and be it from both sides. Am I tracking?
No, you're tracking right, and saying something very similar here. You have to be humble. You have to do all those things. And again, like if I'm Greenleaf, or I'm Spears, or I'm some of these other guys that have written on servant leadership, I would say, don't you know any humble people that aren't Christians? Don't you know anybody that cares for people that aren't Christians? And so there's something more. And then over here.
So I guess I can buy into the statement because the term the leader is not capitalized, right?
Okay.
So the leader can be whoever that person deems to be the leader of their life, which in my case is Jesus Christ, but to this gentleman's point, they may find it as somebody else. And so they could be still could be a servant leader, but it's going to be on the principles that leader teaches.
Yeah, and if Gene Wilkes was here right now, he'd have a heart attack because I took his quote right out of context and I just said the leader, and he would be like, no, wait, I meant Jesus. Okay, so hold on, but I agree with you. So and a secular servant leadership theorist would come and say, okay, servant leadership depends on following a servant model. So who is the model that I'm following? It could be Jesus, it could be other ones. Gene Wilkes would have a problem with that, but there are a lot of people that would line up and say, yeah, that's legitimate.
But how did he write his quote? Did he write it that way?
He did, and then there were sentences before and after that were overtly Christian. Lynn, and then over here to Panya.
So, looking at the quote, when I think about looking at the servant leadership, it's not only who am I a servant of, but the mission that's been given. And so when I look at it, in order to become a servant leader, I first, even in my Christian walk, I have to become a servant to the mission. And so as I look at this, you can't be a true servant leader in, I think, the context of it or the true sense, because you have to become a servant of the overall mission of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Have you read Jesus on Leadership?
No.
Or
Someone gave me the book, and when you had it on the syllabus, I was like, I have that book and it's dusty.
Well, you've already memorized a couple of lines out of it, so feel better about that. Because Gene is going to talk about serving the mission in just a second. Now, what were you going to say?
I think the point he's making here is that you're always going to be serving someone, right? So in this case, it's Jesus. But even, let's say you're a pastor, you may serve the board, you're serving your church council, CEO, you're serving your shareholders, and you're always going to be serving someone, right?
Yeah.
Unless you know who you're serving. It's like my wife, sometimes she complains about her job, and I always remind her, who are you serving? You know, are you serving your boss or you're serving God? You know?
And to carry that out,
Well, that's rough.
you could.
You accept that from me?
But to carry that out, right? Everybody's serving somebody, including yourself.
Yeah.
Right? If you're going after your own interests, that's still kind of a service mentality. You know, it's just all about you. So yeah, now, so Gene Wilkes would come along and he would say, unless, and we talked about this at the very beginning, unless a degenerate person is regenerated through the Holy Spirit, you know, unless grace and mercy is present in your life, you cannot possibly be beyond your own self-motivations. And so he brings in kind of that faith element and says, that's cute to talk about servant leadership, but until you are, you know, basically freed up from your own baggage and from your own sin, you can't possibly be a true servant leader. That's what Wilkes would say in probably a much more eloquent way. Now, this is his model, right? He has boxes, he doesn't have arrows. So I'm going to add in a couple of arrows. But this is his definition of biblical servant leadership. And he always is careful to tag in the word biblical, except in his own definition. He says the servant leader serves the mission, so there you go, you're already there, and leads by serving those on mission with him. Now, how, just from the spec of this, how is that different than servant leadership? Servant leader serves the mission, as opposed to who, if it was Greenleaf, Spears, Barbuto, and Wheeler, any of those other guys, who are the servant leaders serving in that instance? Yeah, they're followers, right? They're serving the people that are with them. And in this particular case, Wilkes says those people will get served, but your primary orientation as a leader is to serve the mission. Now, in his book, what Wilkes calls the mission is your sense of calling. And he uses that pretty explicitly. He says, whatever it is that you feel that God is asking you to do, that is the mission, and that you are serving God by serving that mission. And then he goes and says, okay, if you want to understand the vision behind that and cast a vision to others, it is what your unique take on that mission would be. Okay, which is not actually drastically different from a lot of vision casting and strategic planning material, secular and otherwise. Okay, but he says, so you're going to serve the mission, you're going to cast vision, and so his model works from left to right. And so if you take this sentence here, a servant serves the mission and casting the vision to those they lead, it reads like that. A leader equips the team to serve the mission. So a servant leads, a leader serves. This is all one kind of big idea for him. And these four elements always have to be present in Wilkes' model. Okay? There's always a mission, and that's where everything starts. There's always a vision, which is your unique role. As a servant, you have to be, right, about the people that are alongside you, and so you have to equip people, and there has to be a team. And he talks about in his book where a lot of people talk about you start with 12, you graduate 11, and you focus on 3, right? That model. And so in this kind of setting, this is where we kind of start mixing our terms between leadership and discipleship. And there are some in the biblical servant model that actually like those terms being kind of muddled and vague and possibly overlapping. And we're going to get to that. So just kind of be thinking about that in a second. Wilkes uses a lot of, he treats the Bible throughout his book. He goes after a lot of biblical passages. And he uses this quote also. And he says, head tables have replaced the towel and the wash basin as symbols of leadership among God's people. Yeah, so Wilkes does not pull punches in his book. So if you're looking for something warm and cuddly, this is not it. How do you react to that quote other than some of you are like, ow? What do you think about this?
I'm going to share it.
Make sure you give Wilkes credit, not me.
Hard to disagree with that.
How so?
I think that's what's happening.
Okay.
You want the real?
Yeah.
I mean, if you think in terms of what I see from pastoral leadership, you mostly see them in the pulpit more than out amongst the lost, getting dirty, doing this kind of, washing the feet, we'd say, and giving the orders versus being there. And so that's how I see it. That's how it speaks to me.
Yeah. Of course, he uses the head table story that Jesus tells about, when you come to a banquet, don't choose the place of honor. You might be embarrassed. When you get moved out of that place of honor, choose a low place and, be moved up. And so he really explores that in his book. And there are other biblical servant leader guys that come along. One is a Frenchman, and he wrote in the 80s and 90s, and he said, 3 temptations that derail Christian leaders. One is a desire for relevance, one is a desire for popularity, and one is a desire for power. And he said those 3 things can derail a Christian leader faster than anything else. Relevance, popularity, and power. And so he really goes after this kind of mentality. Now, when he gives characteristics of this is kind of what it looks like. And he has biblical text to go with each one of these. But the first one is humble your heart. And he follows this by saying, and let God exalt you. And he uses that head table story. Now, it is one thing to be humble and to desire humility in a secular servant leadership realm. It is another thing to say, humble your heart and let God exalt you. So in practical leadership terms, what's the difference there? Let God exalt you.
Let others exalt you.
Yeah. Ed and I were talking at the break, and I said, even Greenleaf would agree with this when he said, he has a quote that says, you're a leader, and Wilkes says something very similar, you're a leader when the group says you're a leader. Meaning, if I agree with you serving me, and I'm going to invest authority in you, as opposed to you just taking it for yourself. But he follows this with first be a follower and find greatness in service. And what he's going after here is don't chase a position of leadership. And he'll be very explicit in his book about that. He says, don't chase a position of influence or power or control or whatever. Let that position come to you. Now, if you stand up in front of the Harvard Business School and you say that, you will not get invited back, unless you're going to speak on April Fool's Day. I mean, they're just not going to deal with that. Yeah, they're just not going to deal with that. And so this is a very countercultural idea, and even counter to secular servant models where you can say, yeah, man, in fact, Greenleaf would say, it starts being a servant leader when you feel a sense of needing to serve people, and then you seek out opportunities to do that. And so a secular servant, leadership guy would be saying, I want to climb the ladder so that I can continue to give away that influence and give away everything that I have gotten up to that point. And Wilkes comes at it a little bit more, some would say passive, and says that leadership influence will come to you when God says, okay, now you're ready for it. And so then he chases that in number 4, and he says, take risks. And sometimes people look at that and go, well, those two things don't match. It doesn't match what you just said, let God exalt you and then take risks. According to Wilkes, what he would say is, if God puts you in a position of leadership, you cannot lose it, right? If God's the one that said, I'm going to put you here, now he's not saying be stupid with your leadership position, but what he's saying is, if you need to do something to serve the mission and you're under full conviction that that's what's required, God's going to protect you in that leadership role because he's the one who put you there in the first place. And he would say, if you ever attain leadership through your own effort, you can also lose it either through your own lack of effort or somebody else's superior effort, right? And so even there are some subtle little dodges in here away from secular servant leadership that are really important to making this theory work. And then he says, take up the towel, share responsibility and authority, and build a team. There are other guys that have written on this, and one of them, his name is Don Howell, and he wrote a great book. It's out there on the table. It's also on your notes. And if you're looking for, those of you that went to seminary, if you're looking for kind of a seminary level treatment of this idea of servant and serving God, this is your book. I didn't go to seminary, so it was like brutal for me. But this is a fantastic book, and he wrote this definition of servant leadership. Now, I don't know if I told you this or not. When they surveyed leadership theories from 1900 to 1990, a guy named Ross did it. He came up with over 200 definitions of leadership. And that's just in 90 years, and we've progressed since then, so there are more. Another guy wrote on leadership theory and said there are as many definitions of leadership as there are leaders. And so this is Howell's contribution to this. Now, you'll notice that Howell's take on this is a little bit different than Wilkes, and they're both writing about biblical servant leadership. Howell says, biblical leadership is taking the initiative to influence people to grow in holiness and to passionately promote the extension of God's kingdom in the world. Now, I really like this definition. This is one of my favorite definitions of leadership. For one thing, it's proactive, right? I mean, he says, take the initiative. And I like that. I gravitate toward that. But also, this is very targeted of people and not necessarily organizations or programs, which is where I think all servant leadership theorists would get around that part of it. But it's also very comprehensive. So it's a good kind of takeaway if you're looking for a definition of leadership and you want to kind of chew on one for a while, this is it. Now, Howell also takes apart this idea of being a slave, and he traces it through the Old Testament and the New Testament. And he draws a lot of attention to Matthew chapter 20, which is where the Old Testament word for slave is translated into doulos and diakonos in that verse. And so he says, and in other places where it talks about Jesus made himself nothing, that word there is he made himself a slave. And that word there is doulos. Associated in other texts is that word diakonos, which, we get deacon from and a whole lot of other service ideas. But the way Howell treats it is this is a sense of identity. It's not necessarily a behavior. It's not necessarily something you do. You view yourself as a slave to God and as a servant to people. And until you do that, you're not ready for biblical servant leadership. So we're going to kick around a couple of things here at the end. And the first one is this. Leadership versus discipleship. And we're going to talk about this at a table, and then I want you guys to answer this for me. What are they, how are they different, and how are they similar? So stew on that for a couple of minutes. Leadership and discipleship. What are they, how are they similar, how are they different? We got less than 5 minutes, so it's not that hard. Okay, so what do you think? Leadership versus, and I'll tell you where this came from. I asked a friend of mine who had been doing a lot of research on leadership programs within churches. And the more he talked about it, he kept coming back to discipleship programs. And even when he gave me, material, well, this is what we're doing, whatever, it was all discipleship materials. So I started asking myself the question, are these really different? Now, you educate me, tell me. Leadership versus discipleship, are they the same? Are they different? What's going on there?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. I got that all by myself. Yeah.
All right, so our table statement is that you can have leadership without discipleship, but you can't have discipleship without leadership.
That's good.
I think that's
Interesting.
yes.
Have leadership
I thought it was the other
without
way.
discipleship.
I thought it was the other way.
You thought it was the other way?
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say,
You can lead somebody without discipling them, but you can't really disciple them without leading them.
see, the fun part about this environment is I can argue both sides. So I'm going to argue the other side. If Wilkes was here, he would say, you cannot lead if you're leading well without setting an example. And setting an example is a form of discipleship.
Christian discipleship.
Yeah. But
Well, see, you didn't.
Well, but what I'm saying is you're setting an example somehow. Like if I'm a leader at a Fortune 500 and I'm teaching you, you kill, maim, whatever you got to do in order to accomplish the bottom line, there are people coming behind me saying, okay, apparently we kill and maim around here to accomplish the bottom line, right? So you're doing a form of discipleship, not Christian discipleship, but yeah. No, I hear you.
I'm thinking Christian.
Right.
I hear you. So I'm going to push, and regardless, I'm going to push back on whatever, because this is what makes it fun.
Life and complicated golf.
But I like it. You can lead without discipling. You cannot disciple without leading. I like that. Okay. Nice. So,
As long as
And that goes along.
Go ahead.
overarching leadership is more general in the sense of either a quality or the leading of a bigger body or institution, whereas discipleship is the manifested face-to-face action of that.
So you're similar to that in that leadership can almost be absent from a relationship of any kind, but discipleship requires a relationship. Is that fair?
I wouldn't say absent of it, but this is more vague in general. Leadership can present itself through discipleship, or you can actually lead somebody and not have a relationship. I mean, there's
Sure.
companies and churches where the people don't know that person. The relationship is more of a
Well, if I yell fire right now, I am leading. I don't require a relationship with anybody in here. I'm yelling fire. We should all leave now, right? Now you can choose not to follow my leadership.
Are you notifying?
Huh?
Are you leading or are you
I
notifying?
will be leading because the door's right there. So you can follow me if you want to, but so yeah, I mean I can get around that.
So discipleship seems like it requires time to build a relationship, to be vulnerable, to live life with a person. And you can't do that with a lot of people. You can only do that with a small group of people.
Okay.
When I look at it, I guess I look at them as almost one and the same. The reason why is because as a biblical servant leader, and I'm taking that approach, a biblical servant leader, I'm still being discipled by Christ because he ultimately is the picture that I am following. And when it comes to discipleship, there is that piece where, yes, I'm following the servant leader, but at some point in time, like the members of my table said, at some point in time, as you become this great follower, you will morph into this leader. And so I think if I'm looking at them, yes, two different words. However, when you really begin to look at it, I think that disciplers or discipleship involves leadership, and leadership involves discipleship at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap between the two. I came up in ministry career. I started as a youth minister. I started as a youth intern, really, and these I would see peers that focused a lot on discipleship, which in there was these verses, these theological concepts, this, kind of worldview. And so their students were coming out really well prepared biblically, but then you put them in a group environment and they can't cast a vision, they can't rally people around a goal, they can't do some of these, basic leadership things. And so in those ways, they're very different. But also, if you are, like, if Wilkes was here, he'd say, if you are leading in a Christian way, it involves heavy doses of discipleship. In fact, I don't even know that he would separate the two terms. He might find them a little bit differently. But anything else on this one? Yes, sir.
This similarities, the Great Commission requires both, right? Like you can't escape the Great Commission saying you must lead and you must disciple.
Yeah.
So I think that's how they're similar.
And my favorite go-to on that is very both servant leadership and biblical servant leadership, teaching them to obey what I have commanded you, right? Well, that's not top-down leadership. That's not, we're going to take that hill, don't ask me why, we're just going to go do it. If you're teaching people to obey what I have commanded you, you are modeling the obedience, right? It's inherent in there. It's actually implicit in there. So, anything else on this one?
One last piece. It's I think it's Matthew 4:19 or 4:18. Come and I'll teach, and then Matthew 28:19. Go and make. And so come and teach. So I'm leading and I'm discipling. And then now you get to Matthew, and it's like, okay, go and now you make disciples based upon what I've taught you.
Yeah, and that's something that secular servant leadership and biblical servant leadership, they would both get around that concept of giving away influence to go beyond the leader themselves. Right? I mean, I am equipping my team or my followers or my employees, whatever, to do the job, whatever the job is, and especially do it in my absence.
In other words, I want to multiply myself.
Right. Because otherwise you're not really building capacity. Right? If everything falls apart when you leave as a leader, that is not a good sign of your leadership. Right? It's just not. So let's get to this next quote here.
And that only the good traits I want to multiply.
Yeah, sure, because that's the way it works. Yeah. Biblical servant leadership. So, again, put critical hats on. What is missing from the biblical servant leadership as it is practiced? Chew on that for 2 or 3 minutes. What's missing?
In today's
As it is practiced. So if I'm a pastor or I'm a secular leader, whatever, and I say, okay, I'm going to practice biblical servant leadership, and I'm going to take this back to my organization, my church, my school, my hospital, whatever it is, I'm going to practice this. Where might this model let you down? Chew on that for a second.
Do we have to accept the premise of this question?
Nope, you don't. You do not have to accept the premise of the question. Ed Lumley. Okay. What do you? Now I had one table say I don't accept the premise of this question. So I have another table thinking that I'm trying to trick them. Which isn't out of the realm of
Oh,
possibility.
it's the letter I.
I'm probably doing this spell something. Notice my head whipping around like, are you kidding me? All right, so is there anything missing when this theory gets practiced? And if so, what is it? If not, just say no and we'll move on. Okay, start here and we'll go around. Go.
Well, that started with just the thought that biblical servant leadership has to be evidenced by both your public life and your private life. And oftentimes I think what's missing in biblical servant leadership is the Bible. We exercise servant leadership without the foundation of God's word. So it's really a cultural leadership, it's really a worldly leadership, but it's not biblical leadership.
And if there's anything that I hope we shed light on today, it's that there are a lot of people that can get around the idea that you can be a fantastic servant leader and not have the Bible at all. So yeah.
We have to do things like follow Matthew 18, like actually follow the instructions that are in the Word.
Sure. Yeah.
Because that was one of the things
sorry.
that came up for me. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That was one of the things that came up for me is I was like, as much as I try to embody biblical servant leadership, when you have that chaos or that problem in the church, and it's like as a servant leader, it's like how do I address that situation but still take on and keep that form of servant leadership? And so that was, that was one of the questions that came up.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Now, what you said that you about leadership without the Bible, what did you just say?
I said there are a lot of people that can get around the idea that you can be a fantastic servant leader without the Bible.
Like the disciples.
Well, I was thinking more like Greenleaf, but sure, if you want to settle,
All right. So back to that biblical servant leadership definition. The initiative to influence people to grow in holiness. I think most leaders in the church today got that down pretty good. Character, adjustments in behavior. But the second part, and to passionately promote the extension of God's kingdom in the world. So promoting by investing in people, teaching them how to reproduce as disciples outside of the building, I think is what's missing. So the servant part of biblical servant leadership is missing. Because serve them and teach them to serve others to make disciples that make disciples.
Yeah. Okay. Somebody else. Where, if any, are the holes in the theory?
Well, we said,
go ahead.
I'll tell you, we said without the intervention and the leadership of the Holy Spirit, doesn't make for a good leader.
Sure.
Gotta have Holy Spirit.
Yeah, so far it's almost about I listening, I empathize, I feel. It's like where's the dependence on the Holy Spirit to do the work?
Yeah, and at least as far as Wilkes is concerned, and actually Blackaby and Blackaby, when they wrote Spiritual Leadership, their definition was moving people onto God's agenda. And that, that's their whole definition. And so they would say, and I probably did a poor job of communicating that, they would say they are utterly dependent on the Holy Spirit. Their model may not reflect that necessarily, but I still think the whole exists, right? You can try and practice the principles, but if you have no discernment, right? If you're not plugged into the Spirit and you try and practice anything, all you're doing is cooking a recipe, right? So yeah, there's definitely a hole there. Yeah, what were you gonna say? That was it? You want to share what you said, Kevin?
If I look at the definition that you gave of biblical servant leadership, it says, serves the mission and leads by serving those on mission with me. Okay? So if my mission comes from the Holy Spirit, we'll presume that, and I lead by serving those that I've convinced need to be on that mission, then 40% of my congregation is on mission with me, and so I pour myself into those 40%, but there's still 60% that are sitting at the head table expecting me to cater to them in some way. And so this is the kind of thing that gets preachers fired because, well, they try to stay on mission and they work with those who are on the team and see the vision and thy kingdom come, thy will be done. But the other 60% are always discontent because they're not being served. And so that's the flaw that I saw. So if there's a caveat in there, how do you address the other 60%? In the servant leadership model?
Well, go ahead. What were you gonna say? Or somebody?
I came up with 15%. We had the same discussion.
Yeah.
The one thing I keep coming back to, if you go back to the other slide, easier for me to visualize, is just if I dissect the word servants and try to know that, look at servant in two veins, right? One is the event and one is the intent. So if I think of servanthood as an event serving and then an intent of why you're serving, I think maybe what's missing today is we're really good at the event, we're not so good at the intent, right? So I can go serve homeless people all day long, and that's the event. But if my intent is not to serve them, to bring them into a relationship, or to foster the biblical leadership part of that model, then I've missed the overall definition here.
Yeah, and if there is a leadership excellence, organizational excellence person in the room, and that was really where they were focused, they would look at the model and say, doesn't tell me when to fire somebody. You know, I mean, there are some basic HR problems inherent in this, because at what point do you say this person's actually not helping us achieve our goals? It's not helping us chase our mission. When do I let this person go? When do I not? And there would be somebody, you know, with that bent saying, hey, you know, there are some practical real world questions that I have, and this does not help me address that. Listen, I could do this all day. But you all have not made that kind of commitment, and so that's okay. I hope that there were some takeaways for you in your leadership context. I hope this has served you in some way. If not, that's on me. If you are interested in more of these kind of discussions, the next one is going to be on September 27th. Invite somebody. You know, you don't have to be on church staff to come here. In fact, I hope that not everybody is. And so September 27th, some of you have already registered for that. Same process, go to uvahouston.org/leadership cafe. Thank you all for coming. We're dismissed. See you later.